The morning is cold enough to make the floor sting your feet. Smoke hangs low in the one-room house. Bread from yesterday sits hard on the table. Someone is coughing behind the curtain. And on the beam above the door, a string of garlic swings like a quiet bell. In the corner, a clay cup holds a little fat for the lamp. The wick catches. A thin, friendly light steps into the room. This could be any small village in the 1700s. Timber roofs, muddy lanes, hills that close the world in. Borders change without asking anyone. Taxes arrive like winter. In places like these, life moves on habits. You wear the same boots until the nails remember your steps. You whisper the same prayers until the words feel like a fence around your house. When the cough in the corner will not stop, you do what your mother did. You boil herbs. You crack the window so the old air can leave. You tuck a clove of garlic into a pocket or tie it to the bedpost because the clove is warm in the hand and hope likes small rituals. In these villages there is a rule older than any law. The dead must rest so the living may sleep. Graves are kept tidy, candles are lit, crosses are straight. But sometimes the earth opens too soon. Sometimes a body is pulled up because animals have been nosing at the mound, or because a neighbor falls ill and someone remembers a strange dream, or because a priest thinks a prayer was said in the wrong order. Then fear slips out, quick and thin, the way smoke escapes a bad seal on the oven. This, too, is a world before modern medicine. People watch sickness the way they watch the weather. They learn the shape of it with their eyes. A woman fades over weeks. A boy grows hot at night and cold in the morning. A man spits a little blood into a cloth and folds it away so his wife will not see. Tuberculosis is in the room, but it has another name. It creeps from bed to bed as if someone were calling it. When one person improves, another falls. It looks like a chain. It feels like a hand from the grave. Now imagine a burial after a run of such nights. The village gathers. The bells talk to the hills. People stand in their best clothes and breathe steam in the cold air. The earth is hard. The shovel rings against it. The body is lowered. The prayers done. The cross planted. Everyone wants the ground to be quiet. But quiet does not come. The cough continues in the next house, and the house after that. Someone wakes and swears they felt a pressure on their chest. A mother says she heard her name spoken at the window. A child dreams of someone standing at the foot of the bed. None of these things are proof. All of them are felt. When fear adds up like this, the village holds a meeting. The priest speaks. The headman listens. In some places, an officer of the empire may attend because the empire likes to count and to know. In the 1700s, the empire reaches far, and the reports it collects are neat and tidy. Dates, names, numbers, distances from one place to another. But neat lines on paper do not calm a throat that will not stop coughing. So the villagers vote to open the grave, not because they wish harm, but because they wish rest. Rest for the dead and rest for the living. The earth is broken. Boards are lifted. The air is cool and smells like iron. The body lies as it was left, but time has done its work in a way that eyes do not understand. The belly is swollen because gases build as flesh loosens. The skin is tight and dark, like a fruit dried near a fire. Blood slants from the mouth and nose because fluids rise and settle again when the ground shifts or the coffin is moved. The nails look longer because the skin has shrunk back from the beds. The beard looks new because the face has thinned. The mouth opens a little as if to speak when the head is turned. All this is ordinary if you know how a body returns to the earth. A villager does not know. The villager knows only that the body looks less dead than it should. See, someone whispers, he has been feeding, and the priest, caught between care and custom, cannot say the word impossible. The village acts. The heart is cut, because the heart is where the chain of sickness must be broken. The mouth is filled with a clove of garlic, or with thorn, or with a blessed wafer. Each place has its way. Sometimes a stake is used, not as a weapon, but as a nail, to keep the body in its bed. Sometimes the body is burned. The smoke moves through the pines. The smell makes people look down. It is ugly work. No one calls it a celebration. But when it is done, the living return to their homes with lighter steps. They believe they have argued gently with fate, and fate has agreed to leave them alone. And because the empire writes things down, this moment, mud on boots, breath in the cold air, hands that will not stop shaking becomes a paragraph in an official report. What was fear in a lane is now a line in a ledger. A name, a village, a number of days, a description of the body, the method, the outcome. The report travels farther than any farmer ever will. It crosses mountains on a mule. It sits on a desk under a window in a city where river light enters like a pale ribbon. A clerk copies it. A scholar reads it and frowns. A bishop weighs it against doctrine and order. And someone writes a reply that says, with careful words, that the living should leave the dead where they lie. From these desks, brush and pen try to still the countryside. Men in good coats write that garlic is a seasoning, not a shield, that the stake is for fences, not for chests, that illness is a natural thing, not a message from a mouth that no longer speaks. They do not mean harm, they mean to bring calm, but the words on the page are heavy and slow. They cannot catch up to a rumor told over a fence, to a story carried on a road, to a memory held by a woman who watched her sister cough into a cloth until the cloth grew dark, and so the stories cross borders more easily than armies. They move from a Serbian valley where a single house sits at the edge of a birch wood, to a port on the Aegean where graves lie white and close under wind and salt, to a drawing room in Paris where a gentleman explains to a silent room that reason will light every dark corner soon enough, to a New World farm where winter gnaws at a clapboard wall and a family, tired and thin, trusts the same old methods because they have nothing else. In each place, the grave is the same, the fear is the same, the garlic burns the same small heat against the skin. What ties these places together is not madness nor superstition alone. It is the ache of watching a slow sickness pass through a home. It is the need to do something when there is nothing to be done. In that gap, old customs return like old friends. The clove, the prayer, the opening of the earth. These are tools when there are no tools. And in the 1700s, before microscopes could show the hidden city of breath and blood, the eye guessed. The heart decided. The village acted. Later, other eyes would look more closely. Doctors would write about consumption and contagion. Officials would say the word epidemic. Priests and professors would argue in print, and printers would sell their arguments by the sheet. Some would correct the names and dates and say, "There, now you have the truth." Yet the first truth was softer and humbler. People were frightened and loved one another, and so they did what they knew. Tonight, as the lamp burns low, we will lie still with that truth. The garlic above the door is browning at the tips. Outside, a dog turns twice and settles. The cough in the corner grows quiet for a while. The clove in a pocket warms with the heat of a sleeping hand. The grave on the hill is a dark patch under frost, nothing more. In the distance, a cartwheel clicks a slow measure on the stones, carrying a report toward a room of clean paper and careful ink. But for now, the village breathes in, breathes out. The living ask the dark for mercy, and the dark, for a little while, answers with silence. Kisiljevo, the case that put vampires on paper. The Danube runs wide like a slow mirror, and a small village leans toward it as if listening. In the summer of 1725, that village Kisiljevo counted its houses the way a mother counts her children at dusk. Roofs low, fences crooked, fields thin but stubborn. People lived close to one another and closer still to the ground. News came by hoof and river. Illness came by breath. In one house, a man died after a short fever. His name, in German letters, would be written as Peter Blagojevich. In the language of his neighbors, Petar Blagojevich. Names shapeshift when they travel, but the house was real, the bed was real, the breath that left his lips was real. He was buried with the ordinary prayers and the ordinary care. The village had seen death before. It knew where grief should sit. But within days, another man fell, sick, and then another. They coughed and sweated and pressed cloths to their mouths for the blood they did not want their wives to see. No one understood how disease moves, not yet. They only understood the rhythm. Someone weakens, someone follows, someone remembers a dream. The dead man's widow said he had come to her in the night to ask for his shoes. A neighbor said he had felt a weight on his chest that pressed the breath out of him. A child woke with a scream and would not say why. The stories slid across fences like frost. The village had customs for such times. garlic above the door, prayers spoken exactly, a pinch of salt at the threshold so what walks cannot cross. But the cough did not stop. What do you do when your tools fail? You look for another. An old thought took shape, as familiar as a path to the well. Perhaps the dead man was not finished. Perhaps he was the one taking strength from the living. Not out of malice, but because some boundary had been crossed in the wrong order, or a rite had been missed, or the earth had been disturbed. In that thought, there was fear. In that fear, there was a plan. Open the grave. Look. Make it right. Here the village ran into an empire. The Habsburg state had moved its borders like pieces on a game board. Kisiljevo lay in a zone watched by clerks and officers who liked to record. So when the villagers demanded the grave be opened, they did not do it alone. A local official was called an imperial provisor named Ernst Frombold, the sort of man who carried sealing wax and a good pen, who believed that lines on paper could keep the world orderly. He did not share the villagers' customs, but he understood their worry, and he had orders to observe. They went to the graveyard. The air was wet and smelled of leaves. Dirt gave way to wood. Wood gave way to the same human fact everyone must face, a body that had once been warm. Only the body did not look as the provisor expected. The skin had tightened and turned darker, which made the beard and nails seem to have grown though they had not. The belly was swollen from gases made by quiet work inside the coffin, and there was blood where the mouth met the teeth, the sort of dark fluid that can rise when a body is moved. Frombold looked. The priest looked. The villagers looked. They saw what their minds were ready to see. The villagers whispered that the dead man had fed. Today, if this happened, a health officer would speak to the village about decomposition. They would explain taphonomy, the science of what the earth does to us when we return to it. They would talk about bloating, purging, the way hair seems to lengthen when skin shrinks. They would show a diagram, maybe even a short video on a phone. In 1725, there was no diagram, there was a custom. The heart was the hearth of the body, the seat of life, and the knot of bonds. If the dead held the living, the knot must be cut. Frombold did not swing the blade himself. Officials like him prefer to witness, not to act, but he signed the paper that allowed the villagers to follow their rule. They cut the body, and they found blood in places they thought should be dry. They took that as proof. A stake was driven, not as a weapon but as a nail to keep the sleeper in his bed. The body was burned. Smoke drifted over the fields and tucked itself under coats. No one cheered. This was not sport. It was maintenance, like repairing a fence in wind. Frombold wrote what he saw. He noted the names as he had learned them, the dates as he was told them, the sights with the calm of a man who believes sight makes truth. He sent the report up the chain, where clerks copied it in careful hands. This is how a small fear in a small place became a piece of imperial knowledge. The report passed from a frontier post to a city office, from there to a bishop's desk, from there, in time, to Parisian salons, where gentlemen liked their stories with a slice of reason beside them. The vampire had travelled farther than any farmer in Kisiljevo would ever go, carried by ink. When you read Frombold's report now, the first thing you notice is the steadiness. He is not trying to frighten anyone. He is trying to record and to calm. But paper has a second life once it leaves your hand. It becomes what readers make of it. Those who already feared the dead saw confirmation. Those who prized the Enlightenment saw a chance to correct, refute, educate. The vampire became a mirror for Europe's argument with itself. The intimate knowledge of the village against the distant knowledge of the city, the slow hearth against the quick lamp. What did the burning change? The villagers said the chain of sickness slackened. That is common after a cluster of tuberculosis. It rises, it falls. People recover, others adapt. The mind connects the end of one thing to the start of another and calls it a link. We still do this. When a rumor grips a neighborhood today about a new vaccine, a strange cough, at the school, a medicine someone swears by the first instinct is to do what is at hand. Hang an amulet, boil ginger, refuse a shot, seek a shot. We act from trust and fear long before we act from graphs. Only later do we draw the curve and say, see, it was always going to bend like that. The Kisiljevo case became a seed. It fell on the ground of other villages, Medvedja, for one, where a soldier named Arnold Paule would be accused a year later and sprouted arguments all across the continent. Doctors were sent to observe, priests were told to forbid. Local officers kept taking notes because they had to, because that was their job, because when people are afraid, leaders must stand near them, even if the leader's hand shakes too. There is one detail from Kisiljevo that always returns to me. It is not in the report. Reports do not have room for small feelings. It is the look on the widow's face when she watched the grave open. She had said her husband came to ask for his shoes. Whether that was a dream or grief speaking in the voice of memory does not matter. The question inside the question mattered. How do I live without the person who knew where the bucket was kept, who patched the roof, who made jokes so the children would eat? If opening the earth gave her a way to tell her fear, then the act was not only about death, it was about staying. From Bold would have said the answer is order. Order keeps panic from spreading like a grass fire. He was not wrong. Order is why we have ambulances that arrive fast and vaccines that wait in coolers and charts that show how many beds are full. But there is another answer, older, that villages understand. It is to stand together at the edge of the thing that frightens you and do something, even if the something is small and old and looks like superstition to people far away. In 1725, that meant garlic and tools and ash. Today, it might be a WhatsApp group that checks on the old woman at the end of the lane, or a meal left at a sick neighbor's door, or a handmade sign that says, "Masks please," taped to the shop window. The shape changes. The wish does not. After the smoke cleared, Kisiljevo went back to the work that always returns: mending, harvesting, patching roofs, getting through winter. The report went on traveling. It found its way to readers who would spin it into lectures, then stories, then plays, then books. Later still, artists would sand off the village mud and polish the idea into a prince with cold hands and an expensive coat. But if you strip the gold away, the first story is plain. A family fell ill, a village reached for its oldest tool, an empire wrote it down. That is how vampires entered the headlines. Not from castles, but from kitchens. Not from storms, but from coughs. When we finish the tale of Kisiljevo for tonight, let us leave the villagers where they want to be, together, a little safer, their fear named and carried out to the edge of town in the form of smoke. Let us leave Frombold at his desk, putting sand on wet ink, so the words will dry without smearing. And let us keep one quiet lesson for our time. When the unknown knocks, we need both the hand that holds the old key and the hand that flips on the new light. The village did not have the light yet. They used the key they had. In their way, they kept the night from taking more than it had already claimed. Tomorrow we will walk on to the next place, where soldiers and surgeons try to turn rumor into evidence, and where the word vampire finally learns to wear a uniform. But for now, the river breathes its slow breath, and the houses of Kisiljevo draw their shutters closed, and somewhere, a single clove warms in a pocket, pressed between a palm and the beating of a living heart. Medvedja. When the uniforms arrive, snow takes a different tone on the border. It is not just weather, it is policy. In the winter of 1731, the hills around the village of Medvedja wore a thin, hard crust that sang under boots. The Habsburg frontier ran like a stitch through the land, pulling soldiers, notaries, priests, and veterinarians into little posts where the empire touched the edge of the Ottoman world. Here, the wind carried more than cold. It carried orders, countersigned and folded, and it carried a word that was about to leave folklore and enter the filing cabinet: vampire. People remembered a soldier named Arnold Paule. Some said he had served on a far frontier and met the thing in a place where the river slowed and the trees leaned. He had told neighbors that he broke the curse. He smeared himself with grave earth. He swallowed a bit of the soil. He touched his lips with the dead thing's blood, the way the old fighters taught. He did these things because he wanted to be safe. A man uses what he knows. Then he died, not from the thing he feared, but from a fall. A cart, a broken neck, the sort of bad moment that ends a life in one turn of the wheel. He was buried like anyone else. Cross, earth, good words, a return to quiet. But the quiet did not hold. Winter pressed in. People began to sicken again. A woman in one house, a boy in another, A strong man who had harvested well in summer and now could not lift the pail. They stopped breathing in the night, or they breathed too fast and then too slow. Red-stained cloths, a low fever, ate at ribs. The village drew a line between the grave and the beds. It was not a straight line, but it was the line they had. They opened Paoli's grave first. It brought the same dark surprises villages had been seeing for years: swollen belly, darkened skin, a mouth wet with what looked like fresh blood. They did what their fathers had done. They staked, they burned, they spoke the prayers that travel with fire. The smoke climbed and thinned. For a while, people said the nights were easier. But weeks passed, and the deaths gathered again. A rumor buckled into a certainty. Paoli had bitten others, and the others had risen. Names were said quietly, then louder. Graves were opened, more than one, then more than a dozen. Some bodies looked the way fear said they should look: sound and ruddy, with blood where mouths meet teeth. Each finding strengthened the story. Each act was meant to cut a chain. This time, the Empire did not stay at the edge of the field. Officers sent word up the line, and the line sent men in good coats with satchels. The Empire loved experts, and on the frontier, the closest thing to a pure expert was the military surgeon, the man who knew how to stop bleeding, count a pulse, and keep 1,000 lives inside a column moving forward. They spoke many languages: Latin for reports, German for orders, the local tongue learned in the market. They arrived in Medvedja with notebooks and knives wrapped in cloth. The surgeons asked for lists, and the lists were made. 13 bodies here, 4 more there. Ages, relations, days between death and exhumation. They walked through the cold like inspectors of weather, watching how breath fogged and vanished. Then they lifted lids. Visum et repertum, seen and found, would be the name of their report, because the order of their work was simple: look, write, decide. They wrote that some bodies lay as if sleeping. The skin had not collapsed into the bones the way textbooks said it should. The hearts were not shriveled husks, they held fluid. When blades touched flesh, there were the small movements that gas can force. When stakes went in, a moan sounded, the cough of trapped air leaving the chest. Not a voice, but to the ear of a village, a sound is a sound. The surgeons were not cruel. They were careful. They knew the ways a body takes apart. They also knew what fear does to a room. So they wrote in a cool hand and used plain words. They said what they saw. They did not mock the villagers. They did not mock the priests. They measured, they signed, and they recommended burning the bodies that looked incorrupt, the ones the village already suspected. The pyres were lit. Wet wood complained, then accepted the fire. The smoke smelled of pine, resin, and the last heavy sweetness that comes from flesh. It rose and leaned away on the wind as if it had business elsewhere. And something did ease. Clusters loosened, as they sometimes do when winter breaks, or when the worst of a disease has already taken those most exposed. But now the story had uniforms. The men who witnessed it wore the emperor's colors. The paper that carried it bore Latin headings and signatures, rooted in rank. When their report traveled, copied, sealed, and forwarded, it moved like a regiment. It reached cities that trusted uniforms more than kitchens. It walked into universities crammed with new instruments and old pride. It knocked on the doors of bishops who had dossiers to keep and scandals to avoid. The vampire stepped into the bright room and did not blink. What did the surgeons believe? They believed in observation. They believed that if you took enough notes, the world would reveal its habits. Their pages list the days, the count of graves, the textures of skin, the color of the fluid in the heart, the way the diaphragm behaved when pierced. They built a kind of early dashboard: case numbers, timelines, interventions, outcomes. If you have lived through a new illness in our time, you know this rhythm. First come the charts in pencil, then the charts on screens. First a rumor, then a briefing, first a story, then a protocol. We think we are far from Medvedja until we notice our sentences. We saw 3 cases today. We recommend isolating the house. We have to break the chain. The report did more than describe bodies. It drew lines between ways of knowing. The surgeon's line is the thing in front of the eye. The villager's line is the pattern remembered over years. The priest's line runs through doctrine and through the experience of having buried more people than he can count. The officer's line runs to the capital, because the capital wants the border quiet. In Medvedja, all these lines crossed at the open mouth of a grave. None of them were foolish. Each was trying to protect the living with the best tools at hand. There is a moment that never appears on paper. It happens after the last pyre is raked and the surgeons have counted their instruments and the priest has returned the censer to its hook. The officer writes a note by candle and blots the ink. He looks up and sees a mother and her grown son on the path home. They walk slowly. The son carries nothing. The mother holds a scarf tight under her chin. They are not speaking. They do not need to. The thing they wanted, the end of the nights of watching, the end of the panting breaths might be near. They cannot know for sure. But for the first time in weeks, the mother is not afraid to open her door. If you stand very still with that image, you can hear our century breathe inside it. We too have watched uniforms arrive, nurses in scrubs with fogged glasses, survey teams with clipboards, health officers measuring distances on maps. We too have waited for a knock that meant help or an answer, or at least a plan. And we too have learned how much a report can travel. A line typed in one town can swing policy in another by morning. A chart updated at dusk can steady a city at night. The surgeons titled their document in Latin because Latin wrapped things in order. Visum et repertum, seen and found. We do the same in another language. Executive summary, key findings, recommendations. Behind these headings, there is always a village. There is always a kitchen where someone boiled water and held a hand and asked the old questions in the old order. Will this pass? Will we live? How can we help it pass? The Medvedja report arrived in Vienna and then in Paris, where men in wigs argued if reason should send soldiers into the churchyard or keep them in the barracks. Pamphlets were printed, lectures were given. Some said the surgeons had been duped by peasants and shadows. Others said the peasants knew something the books had forgotten, that fear obeys ritual as much as it obeys logic, and if you want the fear to step out of a house, you must give it a door. For Medvedja, the door was ash. When the surgeons left, the village did what villages do. It repaired fences, refilled the shed with dry wood, reminded children not to jump from the low barn roof, even when the snow promised a soft landing. The graves lay level under the thaw. In the spring, grass hid the places where fire had been. The report went on without them. It gathered arguments to itself like burrs on a coat. It made the vampire a topic, not just a fear. If there is a lesson to carry to bed tonight, it is a small one, and enough. When the unknown comes, we need both kinds of courage. We need the courage of the hand that opens the window and ties the garlic, because that is what your grandmother did and it helped her sleep. And we need the courage of the hand that takes the temperature, writes the date, and calls the next town, so that help can move along the road. In Medvedja, both hands worked together for a little while. The night loosened. People slept. Tomorrow we will follow the paper further, into rooms where bishops weigh souls and scholars weigh evidence, and into another seaside place where the earth holds a different name for the same fear. But for this hour, let us stay where the snow makes a music under boots and a mother and son walk home slower than the wind, the uniforms behind them, the fire done, the door ahead, the wind over the islands, Vrykolakas. The sea keeps old stories like jars of salt. In the Aegean, wind combs the water until it shows its threads silver, in morning, iron by night. In the early 1700s, long before the word vampire filled European salons, the islands already had a name for the restless dead, Vrykolakas. The word rode in on fishermen's boats and left again on the same boats, tucked between nets and the day's catch. Priests knew it. Widows whispered it. Children tested it like a loose tooth after dark. On Mykonos, houses turned their backs to the wind with white shoulders. Doors were painted blue to teach bad luck to pass by. The church bells were small but steady. The rules of burial were steady too. In the Orthodox way, the dead were laid down, blessed, and left to the work that time and earth do together. Years later, when the soil had done its part, the family returned. Bones were lifted with care, washed with wine, and placed in an ossuary, a house of small memories stacked in order. This second ritual was not a reopening, it was a continuation, proof that love and duty do not end at the first shovel of dirt. But sometimes the second ritual went wrong. Sometimes, when the grave was opened, the earth gave back a body that looked too full of itself, skin firm, beard clear, nails like a challenge. No one there had studied the chemistry of silence. They knew only that some bodies seemed to argue with the ground. On such days, the word vrikolakas moved from the corner of a room to the center. People crossed themselves, candles were lit, the priest took out the thinner books, the ones for troubles not covered by sermons. There was a winter when a man died after a dispute over olives and fences, the sort of quarrel that grows like a weed in dry soil. He was not beloved. After he was buried, things went missing, bread left cooling on a sill, a knife, a bundle of wool. Chickens were found with necks limp. Someone swore they heard slow footsteps on the roof in the night, the tread of a man who knows his way across beams. Fear does not start at a shout. It starts at a hum and grows in the ear that is already listening. On market day, a stranger with a leather satchel stood by the quay. He was a traveler, a collector of plants and names, a man who believed that if you wrote down a place carefully enough, you could take it with you without stealing anything. He had been sent by more than curiosity. Letters from polite rooms in far cities asked him to bring back things: a seed, a pressed flower, a story, a specimen of the ordinary. He did not come hunting the vrikolakas. The vrikolakas found him by being the loudest thing in the square. "Come," said the baker's cousin, who had the habit of knowing where everything was happening. "You should see what the island knows that books do not." They walked up the path between low walls, past fig trees scabbed by wind, to the churchyard. The priest met them with a face that had learned to be calm when the surrounding faces trembled. The men who had argued for opening the grave stood with their hands hidden in sleeves. The widow stood to one side, lips pressed thin. The travelers stood where they were told, strangers obedient to a grief not theirs. Stone was moved, earth gave. The coffin came up like a boat, pulled onto shingle. When the lid was lifted, even the wind paused to listen. The body looked more like sleep than like surrender. The skin had the color of old wax. The mouth showed a line of dark at the teeth. The belly had risen. Those who had opened graves before nodded, as if finding again a paragraph they knew by heart. Those who had not felt the ground tilt under their thoughts. The traveler wrote in his book with fast strokes, his handwriting trying to keep up with what his eye wanted to remember. He knew enough of the body to recognize the tricks time plays, that skin pulls back from nails and hair, that fluids can rise, that gases complain when a chest is pierced. He knew, too, that knowledge cannot step between a family and their fear like a judge and expect to be obeyed. The priest recited. The men chose. On the islands, the rules were particular. You did not always burn. You might pierce and turn. You might remove a heart and bury it in a separate place. You might carry the body to a rocky, forsaken cove where salt and sun did their slow, thorough work. Some said that if a man had been excommunicated in life, cast out of the mystery of the church, then in death the earth would refuse him, and he would walk. Others said the wind did not like certain men and spat them back. In fear, explanations breed like kittens. They did not make a spectacle, they made a repair. The priest's voice braided Greek and silence. The knife did what knives do. When the chest gave a sigh, some flinched and some nodded grimly. None of them called it a miracle. Smoke stitched the air for a little while, then lifted. Sea and sky resumed their old argument. In the weeks that followed, the island settled like a room after a broken plate is swept. The chickens clucked and forgot. The footsteps on the roof became only wind. People slept more and spoke less. Fear had been given a shape, and the shape had been undone. The traveler finished his notes, added the taste of the bread and the color of the water at noon, and put his book away. When his ship left harbor, the island did not wave. Islands keep their gaze on the line where the next weather forms. What do we do with this scene now, when our pockets hold small, shining libraries, and our first instinct is to search, scroll, and declare? It would be easy to stand on the quay with a phone and say, they were wrong. It would be easy to mock what we call superstition. But if we look with kinder eyes, we see something like ourselves in another costume. They had a word vrikolakas to name their restless fear. We have other words: misinformation, panic, virality. They had a ritual to make fear hold still long enough to be handled. We have our rituals too: press conferences, dashboards, hashtags, homemade signs on shop doors. The tools change. The need underneath does not. There is a part of the island's story that belongs less to doctrine and more to daily life. It is the custom of exhumation, the bringing up of bones after years have passed. In that act, the living learn that mourning is not a single day but a practice. You return to the place where you last said goodbye and say it again, softer, with more understanding. You touch what remains and keep what can be kept. When the bones go into the ossuary, the family's memory becomes part of the village's memory. Everyone knows where everyone is. In such a world, a body that does not follow the order is not merely a curiosity, it is a moral and social problem. The Vrykalakas is not just a threat, he is a breach of etiquette. Today, our breaches take other forms. A rumor that refuses to decay, a grievance that keeps its shape across years, a lie told with such confidence that it grows skin. We open these graves, digital, political, personal, again and again, looking for the thing that won't rest, and we argue about the right remedy. Do we burn it? Do we ignore it and hope the air takes it away? Do we take it apart, piece by piece, and put it somewhere it can't walk back into our houses at night? Every society builds an ossuary for what it cannot carry in the living rooms of the mind. The traveler's account sailed north. In port cities it changed hands, moved into other languages, lost a little salt each time. In Paris, people read it by fires that had never smelled of resin and called it an anecdote, an illustration for a lecture about reason. In Vienna, a clerk underlined the part where the priest cooperated with the men of the village and wrote in the margin, "Local customs persist, engage rather than condemn." Advice from 3 centuries ago that still sounds modern when we are tempted to shame a community instead of standing in it and mending what can be mended. Back on the island, spring came like a lid lifting. Goats stepped with new certainty on the same old paths. The ossuary door was opened for another family. The small skull was washed as if it were a cup. Children chased each other between the graves until mothers hissed them quiet and then smiled at their own scolding. The man whose grave had been opened was discussed less and less. If his name was used at all, it was to steady a child who would not sleep, or to make a point in an argument that had run too long. Don't be a Vrykalakas, accept what's done. In time, even that thinned. The sea keeps old stories like jars of salt, but it does not keep them forever. It evaporates them down to a grain you can hold on your tongue, bright and sharp. The grain from this story is simple. When the living are frightened, they ask the dead to teach them how to live. In the Aegean, the answer came in the language of rituals and wind. Keep order, keep kindness, keep watch, and when something refuses to lie still, bring the village to the threshold and address it together, not alone. We will carry that grain with us as we cross the water to another shore, where winter is harsher and barns are large, and the word is no longer Vrykalakas, but something closer to home. There, in a new world field shut tight by frost, another family will keep watch by a failing fire and make a choice they believe will save the rest. Before we step onto that frozen ground, let the islands close behind us. Let the blue doors hold. Let the bones rest in their neat house. Let the wind take what remains of the fear and make it light enough to pass. Paper against fire. Kalmate, Van Swieten, and the Age of Answers. In quiet rooms far from muddy lanes, candles lean toward paper. The men at those desks were not digging, not lifting lids, not coughing into cloths. They were writing. And in the middle years of the 1700s, their ink tried to do what stakes and smoke had been asked to do. Make the fear stop. First, there was a monk who loved books almost as much as he loved order. Dom Augustin Calmet lived among shelves that smelled of leather and dust and time. He had a farmer's patience and a librarian's memory. In 1746, he sent out a heavy volume with a longer title than a line of fence posts, dissertations on apparitions and spirits and the walking dead, including the new word that had begun to bump elbows in Europe's parlors, vampires. Calmet did not write to frighten, he wrote to gather. He picked up every story he could find, like a man walking a field and collecting fallen twigs for one careful fire. He compared reports from far villages, measured rumors against each other, and asked the steady questions of a teacher. Who told you this? When? What did you see with your own eyes? He was not cruel to villagers. He was not mocking. He believed in God and in the weight of proof. Reading him is like watching a miller weigh grain. One scoop, then another, then a press with the palm to settle what is puffed with air. he said, as gently as a scholar can say it, that many proofs looked like the ordinary work of the grave or the ordinary work of fear. He reminded his readers that excommunications and grudges are poor reasons to punish a body that cannot defend itself, and he argued that bishops should speak to their people the way fathers speak to children, firmly, but with care and with reasons that can be held in the hand. Across the map, the Empress had a doctor who liked bad air to have names. Gerard van Swieten wore a neat wig and wrote crisp sentences. Maria Theresa trusted him because he could count and he could calm. When reports of stakings and burnings reached Vienna, Moravia, Silesia, the borderlands where winter lasts longer than it should, she sent van Swieten to look, to listen, and to come back with something better than rumor. He did what Calmate had done from a distance, only at the edge of the pits. He asked families what they had seen. He spoke to priests who had stood with men in the frost and read the thinner books. He watched bodies in the first hours and in the last. He knew medicine, as it was then, pulses, under fingers, lungs against ears, the careful opening of the dead to learn how the living work. He returned with a report that spoke in the plain voice officials use when they want to be obeyed. No more graves opened for fear alone. No more staking. No more burnings. Instruct the clergy. Instruct the officers. Treat illness where it lives, in houses, in habits, in air. Maria Theresa signed. Paper moved down the roads that soldiers marched. Edicts were read from pulpits in the same churches where incense had once braided with the smoke of burning hearts. It felt, to many, like the sun coming up after a night of bad dreams. It felt, to others, like strangers taking away the last tool a village had left. That is the hard thing policy learns each time it visits a kitchen. To a parliament, a decree is a clean line. To a mother, it is a hand touching her stove. The cities were awake now. Paris liked its talk hot and its logic cool. Voltaire, all grin and knife, took the vampire as a chance to skewer churchmen and mock credulity. Others used it to lecture about superstition. Pamphlets fluttered like sparrows around a granary. The story that began with a sick room and a neighbor's whisper became an argument about who should be allowed to say what is real. The man with the muddy boots, the man with the stole, or the man with the seal. Yet, even as the arguments stacked, a small, useful change moved, slow as sap, through the countryside. Priests learned how to explain rot without losing faith. Officers learned how to stand with villagers through a night without promising magic. Doctors learned how to talk about lungs as rooms that can be aired, about bedding as something that can be boiled, about the way breath carries both life and harm. None of this was quick. It never is. A habit is a fence you rebuild with the same old rails until one day you notice you have set them in a new line. This is where today looks back at then and nods. We, too, have watched edicts walk into our lives with clean signatures and hard edges. We, too, have watched science learn in public, seen advice change as numbers climb and fall. We, too, have asked whether a rule that makes sense in a city makes sense at the edge of a field. And we have learned again that the way you deliver the truth matters almost as much as the truth itself. Van Swieten was right to ban the burnings. He was wise to explain why. Calmet was right to weigh tales. He was kind to the tellers. Reason without respect is a locked door. Respect without reason is a window left open in winter. People fall sick in both. A small scene from those years. A bishop in a chilly study, his fingers ink-stained, listens to a young priest who has ridden 2 days to beg for advice. The priest's parish has seen 3 deaths. The men want the spades. The priest wants peace. The bishop takes from his shelf Calmet's book, thick as a brick, and from his drawer a folded summary of Van Swieten's report. He reads for a while. He writes a letter the priest can carry back, not only forbidding the act, but giving the priest sentences to say in the square, about bodies, about breath, about God's order in small things as well as big, about how care is not only prayer but also clean water, fresh air, and the patience to wait through a fear's last cough. Another scene. A village headman holds the edict with 2 hands as if it were a hot pan. He knows the men who will hear it. He knows they're dead. He reads slowly, because words from far away should be offered like bread, not thrown like stones. After, he says, "We will not open the graves." Then he adds, "We will open the windows," and a few men laugh, and the laugh makes space for the day to go on. Was the vampire killed by science? Not exactly. The vampire was moved from the churchyard to the page, from the page to the stage, from there to the printed novel, and from the novel to the glass of the screen. The fear that once stood at the foot of the bed learned to sit in a story we can close. And in that space, medicine learned to name the older enemy consumption, tuberculosis, and to push it back with things stronger than garlic. Light in sanatoria, rest, later drugs that carried a bite better than any steak. Even then, even now, the old habits do not vanish. They go quiet, like coals under ash, and glow again in certain winds. The lesson we carry to our own rooms is plain. When fear rises, it asks two gifts from us. The first is explanation that respects the listener, clear words that fit in a pocket, reasons that can be passed around a table without breaking. The second is ritual that does no harm, acts that let hands be busy while minds learn to wait. Calmet offered the first in pages, Van Swieten offered the first in rules. Villages, chastened but not shamed, kept the second in ways that turned toward care, a vigil that ends with soup and fresh blankets instead of ash. Tonight, if you listen, you can still hear paper, the soft rasp of a page turned in a quiet house, the flat, sure smack of a seal pressed and lifted, the hiss of a pen as it finishes a sentence meant to hold a town steady. And under it, the older sounds go on, a cow shifting in its stall, a child's cough that breaks and then calms, a door opened to let the good air in. Fire once answered fear, then paper tried. Now, the best nights, they work together, the warmth of a lamp and the warmth of a rule, the comfort of a story told right and the comfort of a plan shared simply. We will sleep with that thought, that answers to last must be both true and bearable. In the next part, we will leave the desks and walk into the city where print itself made a kind of midnight sun, London's presses, Paris's journals, and watch how headline and rumour learned to trade places, and how a creature born from coffin custom became a gentleman of ink and cape. For now, let the monk close his book, let the doctor wash his hands, let the edict dry on the bishop's table. The graves are quiet. The garlic dries on the beam. The window is open just enough to let the room remember the shape of fresh air. Ink that didn't sleep, how presses turned whispers into world's night, makes a different sound in a city. In London and Paris, it was the clack and sigh of presses, the soft drag of paper stacked to dry, the bell of a newsboy calling a headline into streets that still smelled of horses. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, fear no longer had to travel by mule or river. It could ride on type. A rumour that would once have died at a fence post now learned to cross neighbourhoods in an hour and oceans in a season. The graveyard stories we've been walking through, the opened coffins, the swollen bodies. The coffin houses began to arrive in rooms where men wore clean cuffs and argued about ideas over cups that tasted of smoke and sugar. Whispers became paragraphs. Paragraphs became habits. Walk with me down a narrow alley off Fleet Street. The printers have ink on their fingers and a printer's patience. Set, lock, pull, repeat. The owner wants copy that will sell. Anything from the borders? He asks. Anything from the islands? From America? Someone lays down a letter recently copied and recopied. A village, a grave, a body that would not decay. The editor touches the page with 2 fingers, not to bless it, but to feel the heat of it. He does what editors do, trims, tilts, thickens the parts that catch the eye. By morning, a story stands in the window with a headline that makes even the hurried pause. Across the channel, in Paris, the same work moves with different music. Salons orbit around wit and sharpness. The journals want pieces that let readers feel modern, informed, skeptical, amused. The vampire, newly named and newly urban, provides the perfect toy for these rooms. Here is a curiosity from the provinces, a columnist writes. Here is a lesson in how fear wears a mask. One reader laughs, another frowns. A third, thinking of a recent funeral, reads with a lump in the throat. The city folds the village into itself and calls it culture. Once fear is set in type, it learns a new trick. It can be edited into a shape that fits the city's appetite. The rough peasant becomes a discreet silhouette. The priest becomes a foil for reason. The grave opens with the neatness of a stage direction. Within a generation, the vampire has put on a coat. It leaves the muddy lane and walks into a drawing room. It stops drinking from kin and starts drinking from strangers. It becomes a figure who can sit across from you and speak in sentences. The old sickness in the lungs is still beneath the coat, but now it perfumes itself and passes as fashion. One night in 1819, London's readers found a marvel waiting in the pages of a magazine, a short tale about a pale, elegant figure who travels in society and leaves ruin behind him. The story wore a famous name it did not earn, and that mistake only sweetened it for the crowd. People tore out the pages and passed them to friends. The vampire had learned conversation. He had learned stairs and salons, and the wrist flick of a man who knows all doors open to him. This was not a villager's fear anymore. It was a city's thrill. After that came the theatres. Paris mounted a vampire who could swoop from the rafters as the orchestra swelled. London answered with its own. Graveyards built on painted flats, and a hero whose fear looked handsome under gaslight. Later came the serials sold for a penny chapters that ended at the very breath where a reader would cry out. Someone would be at a window. Someone would be knocking. Someone would reveal a wound half hidden by silk. The presses had found a rhythm that still feels familiar. The cliff at the end of the episode, the small cruelty of a page that says, "Continued next week." In these stories, the vampire moved further from the farm and closer to us. He learned economy, how to live on attention, how to turn scarcity into hunger. He learned law, how to slip through rules by changing rooms and names. He learned, most of all, how to ride the city's new roads of paper and talk. He flourished wherever people gathered to exchange breath and stories, coffee houses, omnibus benches, park walks, ticket lines. And with each telling, he stepped away from the messy facts of graves and toward a clean symbol that could mean whatever the age needed: forbidden desire, foreign threat, aristocratic decay, the charm that harms. Back in the print shops, the day's other work went on wars, parliament, prices of bread. But the vampire kept his corner. He sold. He started debates letters could not settle. Is this old fear a superstition to be mocked or a mirror to be studied? Is it a shame to find pleasure in a tale sown from real grief? Or is pleasure the only way a city can process a village's pain without breaking? Editors did what editors always do when readers argue. They gave them more. There were corrections, of course, quiet as footnotes, dates adjusted, names spelled one way, then another, attributions set straight and then set crooked again by rumor's thumb. The city discovered that the truth could be printed and still not stick. A misprint might travel better than the correction. A mistaken name might earn more attention than the right one. Readers would swear they remembered what they had never read because someone with a strong voice told it to them at a table, and memory, glad for company, made space. If this sounds like our day, it is because presses and platforms are cousins. The speed changed, the pattern stayed. Here is where we feel the tug from our own pockets. The newsboy has become a notification. The pressman's hand has become the scroll of a thumb. The editor's hunch about what sells has become a string of numbers that learns your nerves. Our vampires are not only men in capes, they are stories that drink our attention and leave us a little paler. Rumour lands, edited for heat. A correction follows, trimmed for cold. Which do we remember? The thing that made the heart jump. We are not worse than those readers under gaslight. We are the same kind of tired, longing for the same mix, a safe scare, an elegant monster, a rule we can learn to protect ourselves, a feeling of being in the know. But something else happened in the long corridor from grave to page. The more the vampire learned to dress, the easier it became to speak plainly about what had once hidden behind him. Doctors, no longer forced to fight a burning at the gate, taught about consumption with charts and cases. City boards worried about housing and light. Writers argued for clean air and for the right of the poor to breathe without a landlord's winter inside their rooms. The story that sold fear also sold, by accident, the idea that a life could be improved by policy. Behind the excitement, a quieter work took hold. Streets widened, sewers laid, windows built, bigger, sanatoria raised where lungs could rest. The vampire on the page and the doctor on the ward walked in step without meaning to. Still, the old habits did not leave. On the last train home, a clerk folded a paper with a vampire tale and passed, without thinking, by a street where a girl coughed into a rag. On a quiet bridge, A woman who had read the same tale stood and weighed her choices for a husband who brought home a cough like frost. The city enjoys its stories. The city also sinks at the far edges under the weight of lives that find no headline. Ink can comfort. It can also dazzle and mislead. Night has always needed more than print to keep fear from entering houses. It needs neighbors and windows and the patience to listen when the oldest stories are trying to tell you what hurts. A last scene before we sleep. The pressman wipes his hands. The forms are unlocked, the tiny letters spilled back into their trays like iron seeds. Upstairs, a boy ties stacks of the days, sheets with string. He will carry them into a dawn that smells of bread. Someone will buy one and turn, first, to the story that promises a shiver. Someone else will circle an advertisement for a new stove. Between shiver and stove, a century changes. Heat moves from wood to coal to gas. Fear moves from field to stage to page to flicker. The living keep learning how to name what they feel and how to keep each other through it. What is useful for us now? Perhaps this. The things that drink from us cannot live without our attention, and we have some say in what we feed. We can pause before we pass along a headline that is all cape and no body. We can read the correction as carefully as we did the first rush. We can make room at our tables for slow stories, the kind that carry facts like warm stones and place them, one by one, in a circle to hold the dark back. The presses, old and new, will always run. But we can choose, sometimes, to be editors of our own night. Tomorrow, we will step from paper into flesh again, toward a place where art and illness met a city of sanatoria and sunlight, where the answer to the undying did not come from ash or argument, but from air and time. For tonight, listen to the last click of the type as it goes back into its drawer, the sigh of a lamp turned low, the street returning to wood and hoof, and behind it all, a quiet truth. Stories shape fear, but they can also teach us how to stand beside it without letting it drink us dry. Mountains that taught us to breathe. Morning in the high country begins with a hush. The mountains hold their breath as light slips over ridges and lays a thin gold edge on snow. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, when cities were still coughing through their winters, people came to these heights for a cure that had no fire and no stake. They came for air. They came for time. The road climbs and bends, and a building appears with long verandas like eyelashes. Chairs stand in rows facing the same direction, toward the sun. Blankets wait on each seat. Nurses move softly, wrapping, tucking, checking pulses, counting breaths. The patients are young and not young, faces washed pale by the same visitor, consumption. They have already tried city remedies, tonics, cod liver oil, the promise of a better season. Here the rule is simple and severe. Rest, fresh air, food, more rest. Windows stay open even when frost fingers the sill. Beds are pushed out onto balconies. People sleep with snow on the railing and stars for a ceiling. The mountains do not promise a cure, they promise a chance. Listen to the regimen. It has the order of a monastery and the quiet of a library. Wake before the light, warm broth, a blanket over the knees, a nurse with a watch checking the small waves in the throat where breath shows itself. Then hours of stillness, each hour asking for another. At midday, a plate heavy with milk and bread and soft eggs. In the afternoon, a walk the length of a corridor, no more, so the lungs work but do not beg. Evening letters, soft voices, a pianist in the corner of a common room picking out a tune that seems to rise off the snow like steam. Bed early, air, always. This was not guesswork alone. In a year that turned a page, 1882, a man with steady hands in a city laboratory saw the culprit under glass, a narrow rod of life, too small to be seen before. He called it by a hard name and told the world the thing that drinks us can be named and traced. Germ theory moved from lecture halls into common rooms. Doctors began to speak about droplets and spitting, about windows and crowding, about how breath travels. The old vampire, the shape we gave to the slow theft of life, took a new form on paper, a microbe with habits. But science needs companions. Numbers are strong, and so are stories, and so are places that hold those stories well. The sanatorium became a kind of school. Here, people learned how to wait without despair. They learned how to live lightly so, The body could put its strength into the quiet war inside. They learned a new ritual that kept fear busy without hurting anyone. The ritual of blankets and chairs, of clocks and calm voices. What fire had been to the graveyard, the timetable was to the ward, a way to hold the hours so they did not tip. In the long afternoons, friendships grew like winter plants, slow, sturdy, close to the ground. A letter arrives, it is passed around, a joke is told so softly it can barely stand, and yet it stands. A girl with a braid reads a book out loud to a boy whose cough steals his voice by evening. A teacher who used to scold for posture now teaches everyone how to breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth, count to 4, rest. The mountain air enters like a visitor the house has finally learned to welcome. Not everyone improved. Some grew weaker beneath the clean sky. Lungs scarred like old orchards do not always bear again. But a pattern began to show. Those who had rest and food and the dignity of a plan lived longer. Some returned to the valleys with strength enough to marry, to work, to carry firewood without stopping. The cure was not a cure. It was a lane cut through the woods so that time could pass safely. Art found the mountains too. Painters tried to catch the white on white of sun on snow. Writers came and sat with their notebooks and turned breath and boredom into pages that still sit warm in our hands. They wrote about the strange society of the convalescent, the way love becomes careful, the way a day can be a lifetime if you live it one breath at a time. They wrote about waiting until waiting itself became a character, with moods and seasons and secret gifts. If fear once wore a cape, now patience wore a shawl. Down in the cities, the idea of air grew legs. Engineers opened streets, builders carved bigger windows into school walls. Nurses pinned on caps and walked from house to house, teaching families to boil sheets and to sleep with the window cracked. Children who coughed were sent to open-air schools where classes were held in courtyards and on rooftops. Students wrote with gloved hands and learned the alphabet under a sky that steamed in winter sun. The mountains had exported their lesson. Light and wind make good medicine. If you lived through recent years, you know this lesson by another name. We spoke of ventilation as if we were rediscovering something buried in an attic trunk. We opened windows in offices built to seal. We ate on sidewalks. We counted the people in a room, not by chairs, but by breaths. We remembered that air is not empty. It is a river that carries both comfort and harm. We also remembered the other part of the mountain lesson, that our minds need rituals that do no damage while we wait for proof. Some of us baked bread. Some sang to each other through small glowing screens. Some sat in chairs on balconies and learned the shape of the sky over their house. Back at the sanatorium, a nurse stands by a door and watches the ridge turn pink. She has learned the names of her patients' coughs, the dry, the wet, the hard catch before dawn. She knows who will ask for an extra blanket and who will pretend not to need one. She knows that healing is an argument between body and time, and that her part is to keep the room polite while the argument runs. She tucks a scarf around a sleeping throat and steps away as if leaving a letter in a quiet room. A young man on the third balcony keeps a notebook by the window. He once worked in a bank and thought a good life was a row of tidy sums. Now he counts breaths and finds in each set 1 to 4 in, 1 to 4 out, a different kind of ledger. He writes a line to the woman he hopes to marry. "I will come down when the snow goes. I will bring you air." He knows he may be lying. He writes it anyway because hope is also a medicine here, measured not in milliliters but in mornings. If you walk the veranda slowly, you will hear a low chorus, chairs shifting, cups set down, the smallest whistles at the edge of lungs. It is the sound of a village remade on a mountain, neighbors by accident, learning the rules that let them share a roof. No garlic hangs from the eaves, no steak leans by the door. There are thermometers in glasses and scales in a corner, and a blackboard where the doctor writes the day's plan in chalk. And there is, under all of it, a humility that belongs to places where people have learned to be careful with one another. Did the mountains end the vampire? The old figure had already been pushed from the graveyard to the page, from the page to the stage. Here he thinned further, dissolved by daylight, replaced by a picture of the thing itself, a bacterium with a long name and a habit of hiding. Later, true cures would arrive in bottles and vials. But first came a cultural cure, a change in how we live together. We built rooms that breathed. We learned to leave space between beds. We gave the sick time without shame. We taught children that clean air is a right, not a luxury. This is the part to keep for our own rooms. Fear teaches us to clutch. Breath teaches us to open. When someone in your house is unwell, you learn the mountain lessons even on flat land. Make a plan simple enough to follow when you are tired. Let air move. Let days have shape. Speak gently. Feed hope. Count the good changes without boasting and the hard ones without despair. The old stories gave us a figure who crept at night and drank what we loved. The new stories give us a way to give back. Light, rest, patience, and the stubborn belief that care, given long enough, becomes a kind of weather. Evening comes. The chair's empty and the blankets are folded. Shadows climb the walls like slow water. A bell sounds for supper, a sound that says more than food, it says together. Inside, at long tables, people eat with tired joy. Someone tells a joke about the sun as a doctor who never sends a bill, and the room laughs the small, grateful laugh of people who have earned the right to laugh. Later, they will sleep under windows that let the night in and keep the fear out. Somewhere in the dark, a cough will rise and then quiet. The mountain will keep its hush. Tomorrow, the sun will lay its thin gold edge on snow again. The chairs will wait, facing the light. New arrivals will learn the slow art of getting better, or at least of getting through. The world below will keep rushing. Here, time will be held like a cup, warm in two hands. And the lesson these mountains send down, the one the cities keep forgetting and learning, is simple enough to carry in a pocket. Open the window, breathe, share the air. Keep one another until the danger thins. From salon to castle, Ruthven, Carmilla, and the Count Knight in the city had learned to glitter. Gas lamps struck little suns along the streets, and windows were mirrors that kept the dark at a polite distance. The vampire, who began as a whisper at a graveside, now knocked at front doors and asked to be let in. He had learned new manners. He had a calling card. First came a gentleman with a borrowed face. In 1819, readers opened a magazine and found a story about a pale traveller who charmed rooms and ruined lives. He was called Lord Ruthven. He moved easily among people who measured themselves by clothes, wit, and the company they kept. He did not break doors. He was invited. The thrill was new. Here was a monster who knew how to smile. Villages had feared a cousin who would not stay in the ground. Cities would now fear a guest who seemed too perfect to be safe. In that tale, and in those that followed, the vampire became a lesson about attention and trust. He did not take by force. He took by being admired. He sat on sofas. He listened well. He made promises that felt like secrets. People around him said the same thing, in different rooms. He understands me. The old garlic on the beam would not help here. What helped was a .com. Slower habit friends who compared notes, families who asked hard questions, even when answers might be awkward. You recognize the modern echo, how charm online or in person can feel like light while it quietly asks you to hand over more than you meant to. Then a quieter book arrived from a quieter place. The year was 1872. The setting was Styria, in a house where the trees leaned close and young women read by windows. A stranger called herself Carmilla. She was gentle, intimate, always near. Her hunger came wrapped in tenderness. She asked for closeness and offered it back. She stepped over the line between comfort and control so softly that even the reader hesitated to name it. This story taught a slower fear. Not the knock at midnight, but the long folding of two lives into one until the weaker could not breathe. It asked questions still useful today. What is love? What is pressure? When does the promise to care for you become the right to keep you? Carmilla's pages are full of small domestic details, tea trays, walks at dusk, mothers who worry and doctors who dismiss. The danger sits in the chair by the bed and smiles. In such rooms, consent becomes a candle that must be guarded. The tale so often talked about as mood is also a set of instructions. Listen to the uneasy voice in the back of your mind. Bring in a friend when your world is shrinking. Name the thing that will not let you name it. Long before we used the words for grooming or gaslighting, the story showed how a mercy can be imitated by a hunger. And then, 1897. The great, strange book, built like a house with many rooms, ship's logs, letters, clippings, diaries that talk to each other, like neighbors through thin walls. A storm-tossed vessel arrives in a Yorkshire harbour with no living crew. A dog leaps to the pier and vanishes into the town. A count with old titles and new plans lays a map on a table and follows the rails into London. Dracula gathered all the earlier shadows and taught them to walk in step. What makes that book endure is not only the cape or the teeth, it is the way it shows a community learning, piece by piece, to fight something that travels by night and by network. A schoolteacher keeps careful notes. A doctor admits what he doesn't know. A friend learns to use tools she has never seen before. A lawyer tries to think like the enemy. A nurse carries light and comfort between rooms. A professor with many books offers stories but listens when the facts change. They do not win by a single blow. They win by sharing information, by moving faster than a rumor, by believing one another when the story sounds strange at first and real later. If Carmilla taught the risk of closeness without boundaries, Dracula taught the power of a team that manages fear with plans. The Count is also a border story. He crosses oceans inside a crate, learns the paths of ships and trains, studies, schedules, paperwork, and the weak spots of a city distracted by its own bright lights. He is the fear of foreignness and disease in a coat that fits too well. He is also the fear of old power that refuses to die, re-entering through new doors. The book knows this and argues back not with panic, but with a kind of civic hope. If we coordinate, if we tell the truth early, if we use the tools we have and make a few we don't, we can keep a great city breathing. Hold those scenes beside a modern evening. Trains have become feeds, letters have become posts, clippings are screenshots. A stranger can enter 1,000 living rooms in a minute with a smile and a promise. Some hungers still ask to be invited. Some loneliness still looks like love at first. The defenses are familiar too. A group chat that compares stories. A friend who says, "Something feels off, let's check." A habit of writing things down so hunches can become patterns instead of arguments. In Stoker's book, the circle around the danger grows larger and stronger until the danger has nowhere to feed. There is comfort in that. It tells us the shape of a cure that is not a potion, but a practice. Dracula also remembered the press that Part 7 left humming. The characters clip articles and stack them. The book understands that printed fear can either scatter people or gather them, depending on who does the clipping and how they share it. In one of its quietest triumphs, a woman takes chaos, news, notes, times, tides, and turns it into a shared map. She is not the one who swings a blade at the end, but the blade could not have found its mark without her pen. Today, we might call that role by other names: analyst, moderator, organizer, but the virtue is the same. Make the frightening thing legible enough that courage can find a foothold. A thread runs from Ruthven to Carmilla to the Count, the question of invitation. Old village rules said, "Do not let the dead in." The city learned to say, "Be careful whom you welcome." The homes in these books are not fortresses, they are places where trust is a tool. Ask the guest to meet your friends. Open curtains light shows things for what they are. If a story or a person asks you to keep a secret that cuts you off from the people who love you, that is not romance, that is a feeding. The remedy, then and now, is company with clear eyes. What of the vampire's charm, the silk that made people forgive the teeth? The novels admit it and then answer it. They do not say, "Do not be moved by beauty." They say, "Let beauty sit with truth and time." In these pages, the hard talk around a table, tired voices. Tea going cold is more powerful than any single brave charge. That is another lesson for our rooms. Be brave in groups. Share passwords. Share calendars. Share the little facts that, when added up, turn confusion into a plan. By the end of that long century, the vampire had finished his transformation. He was no longer a peasant's rumor or a bishop's problem. He was a mirror made for cities and for readers who traveled without moving, who wanted danger they could close at night. And yet he kept the old core. He is hunger without care, elegance without consent, loneliness searching for a short road through someone else's life. The stories that last are the ones that show how ordinary people, clerks, teachers, nurses, friends, answer that hunger with boundaries, daylight, and stubborn love. Tonight, lay the three books side by side in your mind. In one, a man is welcomed because he looks like a gentleman. In the next, a young woman is invited because she seems like a friend. In the last, a count arrives because a whole system of ships and schedules allows him to ride the city's own bloodstream. Each time, the answer is the same shape spoken in different words. Name what is happening. Make a circle. Keep the light on. Help one another think. You can hear the old and new ages breathing together in those pages. The rustle of silk and the click of type. The whisper at a window and the bang of a train door. The private diary and the shared file. The vampire will change clothes again in the next part of our story. Film will give him a face everyone knows, radio a voice everyone can borrow. But the counter-magic stays ordinary and close. A kitchen table, a careful friend, an open curtain, a plan written in a hand you trust. Sleep with that near you. Not a steak or a clove, but a small list. Who would I call if something felt wrong? Who keeps my notes when I can't? Where is the light switch in this room? Old fears learned new names. So did the remedies, and between them, like a bridge you can cross without looking down, lies the truth these novels held up to the night. Attention can be food, but so can attention shared. Light on a screen, the face everyone knows. A room goes dark, the projector wakes like a small moon, and dust in the beam looks like snow. People lean forward at once, the way wheat leans when wind runs across a field. This is the new church of the 1900s cinema, where silence can be louder than bells and a flicker can teach a whole city to breathe together. Into this light, the vampire walks, not from a lane or a letter now, but from a door cut in the air. He has learned a new power, to be seen by many at once. At first, he is a shadow with angles, a creature shaped like hunger itself. The film is silent, the music borrowed from whatever pianist sits near the screen, hands ready to catch fear when it falls. The vampire's body is wrong in ways the eye can't quite name. Too long where it should be short, too sharp where soft would be kind. He crawls up a staircase like night climbing a wall. He lifts his head as if listening to your pulse. He is not elegant yet. He is a rumor wearing bones. In 1,000 towns, people carry him home in their heads and leave the lamp burning longer. Then another face arrives, smoother, paler, careful with its smiles. He wears a suit that looks at home in a good restaurant. He tips his hat. He speaks when sound finally joins light in a voice low and patient as velvet. His eyes promise secrets and safety together, which is how danger often introduces itself. The room leans forward again, but in a different way now. We are not hiding from a creature. We are listening to a guest. The camera teaches us where to look. The hand on a banister, the lace at a throat, the way a curtain rises with no wind. The vampire becomes a lesson in attention. He is built from angles and pauses. Editors learn to cut just before the teeth, to let imagination do work that budgets cannot. Directors learn the ritual of warning, mirrors that fail, dogs that stare, a clock that loses a minute, and audiences learn the ritual of response, fingers to the mouth, a hiss of air, the shared small laugh when dread eases. The cinema becomes a school of feelings arranged in rows. By mid-century, he is a star. Posters shout his name from brick walls. He travels on paper and on voice because radio has found him too. In the living room, families sit around a talking box and hear a door open that never opens. The voice enters like a guest who knows the house better than the owners do. He can be anywhere now, in a farmhouse on a prairie where the wind chews fences, in an apartment where the neighbor upstairs walks like a giant, in a boarding house where the hallway smells of cabbage and soap. 1,000 miles apart, people share the same pause before a whispered line and the same shiver after it. Censors try to tame him. There are rules about how long lips may linger, how much skin the camera may bless with light, how many beats a woman may lie sleeping without a chaperone of words. The result is odd and powerful. The less shown, the more felt. Curtains become characters. Shadows carry conversations. A hand on a doorknob can be a whole chapter. Fear learns restraint, and so does desire. The vampire thrives in that space, feeding on suggestion the way he once fed on blood. Audiences leave the theater full of what they imagined and sure they saw it. Then color arrives, and the red is brighter than anyone expected. In one decade, the vampire learns to live in dark velvet and black capes. In another, he He learns to bloom in crimson and candlelight. He becomes romance and danger, a bouquet that pricks. Some films give him history and castles. Some give him apartments with narrow sinks and a record player on the floor. He changes accent, wardrobe, century. What stays is the rule we learned in the novels: he must be invited. Even in a cinema, we open the door by buying a ticket, by sitting in the dark, by allowing the light to touch our faces. We choose the fear. That choice is a kind of power. Merchandise appears, cheerful as market day. A cereal box puts a friendly count at breakfast. A Halloween aisle grows fangs and capes that rustle like small storms. The vampire becomes a costume you can take off, an evening you can return from. Children learn to say the word without tasting ash. College students put a poster up with a man in a red-lined cloak and a woman in a white dress and a moon big enough to be theater. The monster has become a brand. Fear has learned to hum a tune you can whistle in daylight. Behind the posters, another story keeps going. Public health keeps learning. New treatments shrink old enemies. Hospitals fill with machines that do the listening and counting doctors once did with ear and hand. In one era, the cure for the old undying illness is a window. In another, it is a needle. In another, a combination of pills taken with food and a glass of water. The vampire on screen who changes faces and scripts shadows, a truth off screen that stays steady. When we name a threat, share the work, and make a plan, we take back nights. Television brings him closer still. He enters through the rectangle in the corner, between the evening news and the weather. He learns to be funny, the way all old terrors do when they want to keep a seat in the living room. He also learns to hunt slowly, in episodes that end just when breath catches. Next week, the screen promises, and a week learns a new rhythm. Families add a ritual to their week, like garlic to a beam. Snacks arranged, lights lowered, the dog called to the couch. The vampire becomes a reason to be together. He becomes, perversely, a helper of homes. Then, the screen moves into the hand. Clips travel faster than carts or trains ever could. A pale face smiles, framed by a front-facing camera. A song plays. An old image is cut with a new fear. A rumor wears a cape and rides an algorithm like a horse trained to find nervous hearts. Our time invents its own vampires, stories that ask to be invited and then drink our attention until we feel thin and a little cold. We know the new rules, we still break them. Don't watch that before bed, we say, and watch. Don't read the comments, we say, and read until our pulse climbs. We are hosts who know better and open the door anyway. But our century kept the counter magic from the old books and films too. We still make circles that save us, group threads that compare notes, friends who text, "Did you see this? It smells wrong," and mentors who say, "Here's a checklist, let's breathe." We use light the films taught us to prize. We switch on lamps in our minds. Who made this? When? Why this angle? Who benefits? We invite slowly. We keep the window open. We add a second lock. In a feed full of capes and capers, we practice the homely courage of not clicking share until our head has caught up with our heart. Cinema kept teaching even when it meant to entertain. It showed that monsters are most dangerous when we are alone, and most manageable when we sit shoulder to shoulder and talk during the credits. It showed that a household with a plan, a lamp, a list, a friend at the door can feel bigger than a castle with none. It showed that fear is less a dragon to be slain than a weather to be managed, with roofs that hold and drains that clear. In the best scenes, victory looks like a morning after a woman draws the curtains, a man sets water to boil, someone makes breakfast, someone laughs too loudly because the laughter feels new and good. The world did not end. The room learned its light again. Think of one more room, right now, yours. The light off your device is a kind of projector. The stories you let in are guests. Some sit politely on the sofa and leave at a decent hour. Some stay too long. The old rule follows even here. Be careful whom you invite. If a story makes you breathe shallow and look away from the people in the room, let it wait outside. If a story gives you light to bring back to your own life a plan, a question, a reason to check on someone, open the door and offer it tea. You are the projectionist now. You can choose what plays and for how long. The credits roll on a century of capes and shadows. The doors open. People step back into streets that smell of rain and frying onions and buses and newspapers. They talk, they argue, they imitate the voice that made them gasp. They go home less alone than they arrived. That is the soft gift the vampire, of all creatures, gave to the age of pictures. He taught us how to share a fright and then walk each other safely back to light. Tomorrow we will look at the cupboards where the vampire keeps changing costumes, comic books, club floors, subcultures that made him a flag for outsiders who wanted elegance with their edge. We will listen to how music learned his sleep schedule and how cities danced with their own shadows. For now, let the projector cool, let the dust in the beams settle. Let your room remember it has windows and a switch. When you are ready, turn the light on and see that nothing in the corners is claiming you. It is only a room again, with the ordinary mercy of walls and the old, steady company of your breathing. Night School. How the late 20th century taught the vampire new rules. You can tell when a myth is alive. It keeps learning. By the late 1900s, the vampire had moved from castles and black and white screens into places. Ordinary people actually lived bedrooms with posters, comic shops that smelled of ink, clubs where the lights stayed low on purpose. He didn't disappear, he adapted. And in those rooms, people rebuilt him with clearer rules, closer to the old folklore but fit for modern nights. Invitation matters, boundaries matter, hunger needs a code. Picture a small comic shop after school. A bell rings, cold air follows a kid inside. On a rack sits a new issue, a vampire on the cover. Not a mindless monster, but a person trying to live with a thirst that could hurt others. Inside the panels, the vampire bargains with himself. What to drink, when to stop, who to protect, who to avoid. It's not capes and capers for their own sake. It's a lesson about appetite and restraint. Readers close the book with a quiet thought most older tales never offered. If a vampire can choose, then choices are the real story. Now, a different night. A basement club. Music holding a steady pulse. People dressed in black because dark cloth lets faces glow. The vampire's outline is everywhere. Pale makeup, a red mouth, a coat that moves like a curtain. But here, the point is not fear. It's agreement. May I? Yes. No. Thank you. That's the old law. Do not cross a threshold uninvited, turned into a social practice. The myth's rule becomes the room's rule. No bite without a welcome. No drink that wasn't offered. If you want to see how vampire stories stayed relevant, stand by that door and watch how often people ask permission with eyes and hands before they step close. In bedrooms lit by a single lamp, teenagers try on the shape of the vampire for courage, not the fangs, the poise. A mirror. Teachers, shoulders down, chin level, eyes steady. The lesson is old and simple. A vampire must be asked in. You must learn when to say no. The cape becomes a symbol for privacy. The color red becomes a symbol for honesty about desire. The character is a rehearsal for adulthood, how to carry hunger without letting it carry you. Paperbacks on the nightstand pick up the thread. In these stories, vampires are no longer just predators. They are communities with rules, covenants, and consequences. They struggle with secrecy, loneliness, time. Some feed on animals, some find donors, some abstain and suffer. The language shifts from curse to ethic. You can feel the echo of folklore. Villagers once asked, "How do we stop the dead from taking from us?" Modern stories ask, "How do we stop ourselves from taking too much from each other?" The vampire, updated, is a clean way to talk about needs that never go away: attention, intimacy, influence, and the discipline it takes to keep them from turning into harm. Zines stapled, photocopied, traded by hand carry shorter lessons. One page lists house rules for a midnight gathering. Ask before touching. Respect closed doors. Bring water. Leave people brighter than you found them. Read them sideways and their vampire rules in plain clothes. A threshold is a boundary. Garlic is a signal. Sunlight is truth. You don't need superstition to keep a room safe. You need courtesy strong enough to be a habit. Some nights return to danger, on purpose. A film festival runs a block of vampire movies, old and new. On the screen, the invitation rule is broken. The consequences are fast. Off the screen, the audience laughs, hisses, claps, and walks out together under streetlights. The double movement matters. Inside the story, the vampire reminds you what happens when consent is ignored. Outside the story, The crowd shows how a city survives fear by sharing it, naming it, and going home together instead of alone. Not every reinvention is careful. There are scenes where vampire gets used as a costume for pure taking, parties that forget their own rules, promoters who treat guests as fuel, stories that glamorize harm and call it romance. The myth answers back if we listen. The oldest law in all the tales is simple. What is stolen spoils you. What is given keeps you human. When a room forgets that, the vampire turns from mirror to warning again, teaching the hard way. That charm without consent is just hunger in a tuxedo. Meanwhile, health and policy, the quiet partners of our whole series, keep reshaping the background. Public campaigns teach blood safety, needle safety, club safety. Posters at clinics speak in clear words about risky behavior and how to reduce it. The vampire metaphor makes those conversations easier to have out loud. Everyone understands the shortcut. Don't invite trouble in, protect the neck, share air. Under the jokes sits a serious culture shift, the same move we saw when mountain sanatoria taught cities to open windows. Stories nudge habits, habits save lives. Online, the vampire learns a new house, forums, fanfic sites, group chats where rules sit pinned at the top. Ask before DMing, tag spoilers, no blood without content warnings. The shape is familiar, thresholds, invitations, daylight where it matters. In bad corners, you can watch attention vampires, feed accounts that demand clicks, sow panic, ignore consent. In better corners, moderators carry Van Sweeten's old lantern, explain, slow down, enforce rules that protect the living from being drained. The myth stays useful because the internet is one giant threshold. Every tap is an invitation, step back, and the pattern is clear. Earlier parts of this story showed villages using ritual to control fear, empires using paper to curb panic, cities using press and film to shape a safer thrill. Part 11 is about ordinary people adopting the myth as a nightly practice. The vampire stops being only a threat and becomes a teacher. Invitation isn't polite fiction, it's the boundary that keeps love from turning into harm. Hunger isn't evil, it's energy that needs rules. Beauty isn't proof, time and truth are. Community isn't decoration, it's the circle that keeps everyone fed without anyone being bled dry. Bring that forward to today, and it's still practical. Before you share a post that shocks you, ask if you're inviting a rumor over your threshold. Before you let a person or a project drink your time, ask what you'll get back besides a story. Before you cross into someone else's space online, at work, at home, wait at the door and let them welcome you. If they do, enter gently. If they don't, keep your fangs to yourself. This isn't humor, it's housekeeping for the night. The vampire taught it, even when he didn't mean to. And because stories are easier to keep than lectures, the lessons last. A pin on a jacket, a tiny bat says, "I know the code." A sign at a venue says, "Consent is sexy." A line in a novel says, "He could drink, but he asked first." And a reader learns what to ask for without apology. So when someone says the modern vampire is irrelevant, think of all the rooms he helped set in order. Think of the club where people ask before they touch. Think of the forum where moderators keep thresholds bright. Think of the kid at the mirror learning a posture that keeps them safe. The myth walked out of the graveyard and went to night school. It came back with rules we still need. Tonight, keep one near the lamp. Nothing enters without your yes. If a story, a stranger, or a habit pushes past that, it's not romance, it's a raid. Close the door. If it knocks kindly and offers light you can use, open it and make room. The vampire is still here, but so are you, and you have learned the oldest, newest rule. Choose your guests, then sleep. Counting the living. Afterlives of a myth morning has a way of making last night sensible. A lane that felt haunted shows its puddles. A window that held a face holds only sky. To end our long walk from graves to screens, let's stand in daylight and see what stayed. Garlic dried on beams, paper yellowed on shelves. Movies learned to whisper, villages learned to wait. And slowly, one careful habit at a time, fear gave up ground to things that last longer than smoke. Clean air, clear words, steady hands. Begin with the enemy that wore the cape first, consumption. The wasting cough we now call tuberculosis. For centuries it moved through rooms like cold fire. What pushed it back was not a single miracle, but a staircase of small steps climbed by many feet. A man with a lens named the microbe. Nurses opened windows and boiled sheets. Cities widened streets, built sewers, planted trees. Doctors tested drugs in plain rooms, first one, then two together, then more in a pattern that taught the germ there would be no easy meal. Clinics learned to count pills on calendars. Health workers learned to sit with patients and make a plan that fit a real life. Whole programs were built on three sturdy words: directly, observed; therapy, which sound dull until you remember what they replaced; guesses, luck, ash. Numbers too turned out to be a kind of light. Not the cold kind that blinds, but the kitchen kind that helps you see what you're slicing. When towns began to count cases, they could find clusters. When hospitals began to count beds, they could see where pressure would come. When nations began to count cures and failures with honesty, they could learn which habits worked. The old vampire story measured fear in whispers. The new public health story measured breath with charts pinned on walls. A dot on a map is not a person, but it can save one. You can feel the echo in recent years. We learned again to ventilate, to step back when a room grew tight, to think of air as something we share the way we share water. We watched numbers rise and fall and argued about what they meant. We learned that science talks like a person learning in public. We think this. Now we think this because of new proof. That change of mind is not a weakness. It is a sign the mind is awake. In the 1700s, paper told villages to stop burning bodies. In our time, dashboards told neighborhoods when to mask, when to gather outside, when to make soup, and leave it on a step. Different centuries, same lesson. Good rules delivered kindly can steady a town. What of the myth we have followed all this way? The vampire did not die when the drugs arrived. He shed another skin. In stories, he kept asking useful questions. How do we manage hunger without harm? Who gets to cross thresholds? What do we owe the people who invite us in? Each retelling let a generation practice answers. Folklore once taught how to guard a door. Modern tales teach how to guard a life privacy, consent, attention. When a rumor knocks, we peek through the peephole. Who sent you? Why now? What do you want from my fear? It is the old rule, updated. No one enters without a yes. There is kindness in looking back with open eyes. The villagers who opened graves were not villains. They were exhausted families with bad options. The officials who wrote edicts were not soulless. Some had stood in the cold and wanted the next village spared the same night. The monks and doctors and printers were not always right. They were trying to be, and they left us tools that can be used better than they used them. We inherit both the mistakes and the instructions. That is what afterlife means for a myth. It keeps offering work. Here is a small, clear set of tools to put near your own lamp. Air. Let it move. A cracked window is an old cure with no side effects. Light. Use it on stories. Ask who wrote them, what they left out, how they know. Company. Fear shrinks when the mice. It has chaperones. Make a circle, early family, friends, the one nurse everyone trusts. Rituals that do no harm. Tea at 4, a walk at dusk, a list on the fridge. When you cannot fix, you can steady. Consent, the oldest law in these tales. Practice it in speech, in touch, in time. No one gets your night without your yes. If you want one last trip through the rooms we visited, take this thread in your hand and walk. Kisilyevo taught us that grief will invent a door if you don't give it one. Medveja taught us that uniforms should bring notebooks as well as knives. The islands taught us that communities have second funerals because love takes time to finish its work. Rhode Island taught us that modernity and superstition can share a road, and that kindness for the frightened should not cancel honesty about harm. Calmette and Van Swieten taught us to speak plainly and forbid gently. The presses taught us that a rumor set in type walks faster than a correction whispered at a defense. The sanatoria taught us to breathe on purpose and to give patients a schedule. The novels taught us to fight in teams. The films taught us to sit together and make a plan before the lights go down. The late-night rooms taught us to turn invitation into etiquette so that beauty cannot excuse theft. All of that is not just history, it is housekeeping. It is how a street, a building, A family keeps the dark from learning our names. Some nights you will be tired and the old stories will try to come in wearing new coats, forwarded messages with hot edges, videos cut for shock, headlines that say, "Everyone knows." You have met these guests before. You can stand in the doorway and say, "Not tonight. Bring proof. Bring daylight. Bring my friends." If they cannot, they can wait outside until morning. There is one more thing to count, and it is easy to miss because it is quiet. Survival. Most people, most of the time, choose each other. Not always at first, not perfectly, not without argument, but they do. A village decides not to open a grave. A church opens a window. A neighbor leaves broth. A doctor changes her advice because the numbers changed. A reporter prints a correction and means it. A friend asks, "Are you okay?" and waits for the real answer. If you stack those acts end to end, they look like a bridge. You have been walking on it your whole life. We promised at the start to correct names and dates others get wrong. That promise carries a deeper one, to tell the living what helps them live. Dates are lanterns on the path. They are not the path. The path is breath and bread and clear talk and a door that opens for the right people and stays shut to panic. The myth gave us a language for thresholds. Science gave us reasons to enforce them. Together they let us keep our rooms. So blow out the candle and let the room learn itself again. The garlic on the beam is brown at the edges, and mostly for comfort now. The papers are stacked, the window is open, the width of a thumb. Somewhere a train carries night shift workers home. Somewhere a clinic light stays on over a desk where tomorrow's charts wait. Somewhere a page is being set in type, and the headline is not a scare but a kindness. Fewer coughs this winter. You cannot hear it yet. You can sleep toward it. If you wake deep in the night, and the old visitor sits at the foot of the bed as a feeling rather than a figure, that tightening chest, that rehearsal of worst cases, try the staircase we built together. Breathe in, count 4. Breathe out, count 4. Open what can be opened, name what can be named. Text the person who says, "I'm here." Remember the rule that outlived the steak and the cape: nothing comes in without your yes. And when morning shows the lane for what it is, a strip of earth with puddles and sparrows, make a little list for the day. Air, light, company, a ritual or two, a boundary held without apology. This is how we turn a story about things that drink us into a practice that feeds us. This is how we keep the myth but not the fear. This is how graves stay quiet and the living learn again and again to count what matters most: each other.